Penguin Random House Audio presents The Brothers Mankiewicz, Hope, Heartbreak, and Hollywood Classics by Sidney Ladensohn Stern. Read for you by Jonathan Davis. Prologue. Chapter 1. The End. Joe, 1993. On February 9th, 1993, the family of the late Joseph Leo Mankiewicz assembled in the Bedford, New York churchyard of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church to bid Joe farewell. It was an unlikely resting place for the avowed atheist son of Jewish immigrants, but like so much about Joe, it was complicated. Joe wanted to be buried next to his wife Rosemary, and Rosemary was the daughter of a Church of England archdeacon. The fact that formally becoming Episcopalian made Joe officially not Jewish was just a side benefit. Besides, as their daughter Alex joked, her atheist father probably didn't mind a bit of insurance. Wherever he was going, Joe would not be lonely. He had always wanted to be buried with his cherished pipes and his favorite barking dog tobacco. Matches will not be necessary. But now there was his beloved black lab, Cassius, whose ashes he had saved in a tin. Originally it seemed that Cassius would not be allowed to accompany him. Animal remains were prohibited in the cemetery. Yet there lay Joe, surrounded like an Egyptian potentate with his favorite books, plays, pipes, and tobacco pouch, secretly enjoying the last laugh. Because instead of barking dog tobacco, the pouch now held dead Labrador retriever ashes. As his son Tom said, Dad always hated to lose. Joe's death also concluded the story of the Mankiewicz brothers of old Hollywood, brothers whose lives and careers spanned the history of Hollywood's studio system. Joe and his older brother Herman started in the 1920s writing titles, captions for silent pictures. When movies exploded into sound, they wrote screenplays and became renowned for their witty dialogue. They wrote, directed, and produced some of the most memorable pictures of the industry's golden age of the 1930s and 1940s, and were still there in the early 1950s when the studio system began its decline. Each left behind one of Hollywood's most iconic films. Despite opposing career trajectories, Herman and Joe had much in common, and not just because they were brothers. They were first-generation Americans who hungered for their father's approval, but not enough to conform to the career path he intended for them. They were brilliant students who expected their entire lives to fulfill their early promise. They were German Jews who resolutely defined their background as a religion, not a race. They were both erudite intellectuals and avid sports fans, irrepressible wits, quite capable of wounding, family men who caused their families great pain. Both embraced life with gusto, yet spent their years in Hollywood yearning to return to New York. Both hoped to write a great American play, or at least a successful one. Yet both achieved immortality through the medium they scorned for much of their lives. After the service, Joe's family and friends gathered in his book-lined study, filling the room with talent as they admired the 4 Oscars on the mantel. All of Herman's children and several of his grandchildren had become writers, for print and television, as well as for motion pictures. 2 of Joe's 3 sons and his artist daughter had followed him into the business. As they visited, their common ancestor gazed out from the wall above Joe's writing chair. Herman had commissioned their father's portrait by designer Joe Melziner, and Joe had worked beneath it for nearly 40 years. Now Rosemary and Alex were ready to pass it on. But for all their pride in their heritage, none of Pop's descendants seemed eager to take their progenitor home. Finally, Rosemary decided Herman's son Don, now the senior member of the Mankiewicz family, was its most appropriate custodian. Besides, Don wasn't there to refuse it. Pop had been an eminent and beloved personage in his field, but it was Herman and Joe who made the Mankiewicz name into a valuable Hollywood heritage. Ironically, it all began by accident. Herman went to Hollywood on a short writing assignment, planning to stay just long enough to earn the $2,200 he needed to pay off a debt. But as Joe liked to say, life has a way of lousing up the script. Chapter 2. The Beginning. Herman, 1926. Herman Mankiewicz liked to say that everyone originally came to Hollywood in pursuit of a lump sum. Of course, Herman's everyone was not really everyone who poured in during the 1920s motion picture gold rush. It did not include the pitiful characters flocking in to follow their dreams, whom Nathaniel West portrayed in The Day of the Locust. Nor did it include many members of the movie colony's elite, some of whom were having the time of their lives. Herman's everyone meant people like himself, fellow writers, like his boss and role model, George S. Kaufman, and friends like Dorothy Parker and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who considered themselves slumming, but could not resist Hollywood's lucrative payouts. Like his friends, Herman aspired to higher things and considered money merely an unpleasant necessity of life. However, the longer Herman enjoyed his hefty Hollywood paychecks, the longer his list of life's necessities became, and the harder it became to leave. Herman was hardly the only screenwriter who came to loathe himself for prostituting his talents. But Hollywood did not send Herman on his path of self-destruction. Herman's drinking and gambling led him there in the first place. Herman was only 28 when he arrived, and he anticipated a quick return to his Algonquin Round Table friends, his job at the New York Times as Kaufman's assistant theater editor, his position as the New Yorker's first drama critic, his ongoing theatrical collaborations with Kaufman and Mark Connolly, his identity as Central Park West Voltaire. In short, a return to the life he loved and the profession he deemed worthy of his gifts. One observer in particular watched Herman and hoped, possibly more anxiously than Herman, that he would grab that lump sum and return as quickly as possible. Professor Frank Mankiewicz, a.k.a. Pop, understood that for all of Herman's irreverence, his son was an original and erudite thinker, and he fervently wanted Herman to apply that penetrating intellect to worthwhile endeavors. For Pop, there was no higher calling than teaching, and no worthier existence than a life of the mind. He had given up imagining that Herman would follow him into academia and transferred that particular aspiration onto 17-year-old Joe. But Pop dared to hope that upon his return, Herman might shift his professional attention to subjects weightier than the Marx Brothers. Perhaps Herman would fulfill his own dream of writing theatrical work of merit, or use his considerable knowledge of political history to shine in the world of journalism. Pop's love for his children was beyond doubt, but there was also a dark side to the admirable Frank Mankiewicz. He was a hot-tempered parent with impossibly high old-world standards, and his harshness had already generated in Herman a sense of inadequacy and self-hatred that never left him. Herman always regretted the damage he wreaked on himself and his loved ones, but he never managed to overcome his cycles of self-destruction. Even knowing they practically guaranteed fulfilling the terrible image of himself Herman imagined he saw in his father's eyes. Chapter 3. The Real Beginning. Pop, 1891. If Pop is the key to Herman and a key to Joe, how far back to go? Perhaps a good place to start is 1913, when Herman, not quite 16, and Pop, almost 41, enroll at Columbia University. Herman is a freshman and Pop a candidate for a master's degree. Both will leave that august institution with an education, an abundance of friends and contacts, and the valuable Ivy League imprimatur they will treasure for the rest of their lives. They were unlikely students, so short of funds that Herman's shabby suits changed color when it rained, and Pop lined his shoes with cardboard to make them last longer. Herman was accustomed to relative impecuniousness after years as...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?